The mass deportation plans of the Trump administration have been quickly gathering steam, slowed only by several rebukes from the judiciary. This week, however, the conservative-majority Supreme Court handed the White House a major victory, if only temporarily. Meanwhile, the immigration detention system is expanding massively as old prisons and new construction projects prepare for tens of thousands of new detainees. Welcome to the Politics of New America. I'm your host, Nathan Stone. On the show today, we look at the expanding infrastructure of immigrant detention and how the Supreme Court is paving the way for ever faster deportations by allowing removal to potentially unsafe nations. It's time for another weekly brief. Let's start off with the Supreme Court, where they have temporarily halted a district court order that prevented the federal government from deporting immigrants to third-party countries. A third-party country is a nation that is neither the United States or the home country of the person being deported. So this stay allows the government to continue its deportation policy while other legal challenges proceed. The case itself involves a dispute over the scope of executive authority in immigration. And the Supreme Court is saying that it may take up the issue in the future, but for now, the Trump administration can resume deportations to countries that are not the immigrants' home nations. And the Trump administration really needed this win because right now they have around 59,000 people in custody, in immigration custody, according to CBS News. And that is way over capacity for what Customs and Border Patrol can handle. They really need to get things going with these deportations. The arguments of the Trump administration around this issue had been that the Immigration Nationalities Act that was enacted in 1952 explicitly allows deportations to a third country if the person being deported doesn't designate a preferred removal destination, or their home country refuses to accept them, and that third country does agree to accept that individual, and that they have a broad discretion in choosing removal destinations. They also have argued that immigration enforcement is a core executive function, and that the courts should defer to the executive interpretation of deportation laws. There are some previous precedents where the Supreme Court has upheld kind of a broad executive authority in terms of immigration matters. So this isn't coming out of nowhere. On the other hand, the immigration rights groups and everyone else arguing against this, of course, are saying that this is a present danger to deportees. This policy can expose them to danger through having no family or legal status or support systems in these countries where they're being sent. And even if a country is deemed safe by the administration, that doesn't necessarily mean if you drop someone who doesn't know the culture, the language, and has no support system, that they're not going to be in some way abused or taken advantage of, and that their safety can't be guaranteed. And as I said, the stay itself is temporary, but the Supreme Court could rule on it by fully hearing the case. And if they do, they may come to a different decision. They may come to the same decision. The Supreme Court has been enthusiastic, let's say, and the majority in backing the Trump administration and their interpretations of the law. So we shouldn't necessarily expect anything different from them if they give us a full ruling. Now, what this does, the effect this has, is that for the foreseeable future, the administration can send a deportee to a third country who has agreed to it, whether or not that person has agreed. And also they can overrule a lower court's decision about where to send that person, which opens up a lot of freedom in terms of these mass deportations. Because if you're not worried about what the court thinks should happen, if you're not worried about what the person thinks should happen, well, that gives you a lot of leeway to determine for yourself what's going to happen. This is a vital win for the Trump administration. They really need to start moving people out of the country faster for this mass deportation scheme to work. they've been rounding them up at a clip, but the overall numbers for deportations aren't sky high compared to 2024 under Biden. So if you're incarcerating thousands and thousands of people with the intention of getting them out of the country, but you can't actually do that, you start to run into a lot of problems. Which brings us to the second part of what we want to talk about today, which is the expansion of the migrant detention system. Today's episode is brought to you by Zencastr. Zencastr makes professional quality remote recording effortless. I've used it to interview folks from all over the world. With Zencastr, every guest records in WAV format for lossless audio, and they record locally, so no more dropouts or lag. Get separate tracks for easy editing, live audio monitoring, and even video podcasting support. Then when you're done, automated post-production tools like noise reduction and AI-powered leveling will save you hours. Focus on your content while Zencastr handles the tech. Check out our affiliate link in the show notes of this episode to get started. ICE needs a lot of space very quickly to store the people that they snatch off the streets. And facilities are being built all over the place on military bases. We'll talk about in a little bit the Alligator Alcatraz. But one of the easiest ways that they can go about doing this is by reopening closed prisons. And they've found an interesting loophole wherein, in a declared emergency, they don't need to issue bid contracts. They don't need to go through the normal procedures for finding vendors to reopen these prisons, to run these prisons. They can cut out a lot of that paperwork. So that's in fact what has happened here. And they're using no bid contracts, which basically means, hey, we like this company. We're just going to give them a big bag of money and they're going to do this for us. Now, two huge private prison companies, Core Civic and Geo Group, are involved in this. An example of one of these prisons that's looking to be reopened is the United States Federal Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. It's a little over 1,000 beds, and it's been described as a hellhole by a federal judge. Now, an interesting thing to see is that there has been pushback from the community and from local officials in the city after Core Civic tried to reopen this facility without city officials signing off on that deal. And the city has filed a lawsuit to try and stop this. Their argument being that this wasn't done with the proper due diligence that it should be. Whereas ICE and Core Civic have cited a compelling urgency, basically an emergency, and they need thousands more detention beds. And because of that, they don't actually need to go through the normal channels. Now, nationwide, this push for more detention beds is huge. ICE is aiming to more than double detention capacity from the 41,000 odd that they're at right now. And remember, they are already way over capacity, around 59,000 according to CBS, to 100,000 plus beds. So they're looking at reopening facilities near Newark, New Jersey, Dilley, Texas, and another in Georgia. Now, like everything around this mass deportation push, there are lawsuits, there is pushback. People are warning of inhumane conditions, lack of oversight. There's a lot riding on this for both the communities and for the Trump administration, because again, they need to do this if this mass deportation push is going to succeed. Now, things are already getting so bad in some of these immigration facilities. The Texas Tribune had a very concerning article on June 21st. And to sum it up, families detained in Texas facilities, in immigration facilities, were describing overcrowding, medical neglect, and fights over clean water because of these giant pens that they're keeping people in. 9-month-old babies developing diarrhea after being given tap water for formula, which is honestly, as a father of a 10-month-old, one of the most heinous things I've read lately. a 12-year-old boy with a blood condition being denied proper medical care despite severe foot swelling, a 3-year-old who's been traumatized by the arrests, who's refusing to eat. These are awful things to hear about. These reported abuses are, quite frankly, heinous. And all of these have been put in newly filed court documents as advocacy groups seek to defend the Flores Settlement Agreement. Now, that is a decades-old rule requiring safe condition for detained migrant children. It's honestly fairly ghoulish of a thing to try and get rid of, which means that, of course, there is a ongoing legal battle over the Flores Agreement because the administration is trying to nix the Flores Agreement completely, which means if that were to happen, those minimum health and safety standards for children would vanish, and you would lose much, if not all, of the independent oversight of detention centers, which would leave no way to document abuses like the ones we just talked about. Now, all of this is happening, of course, with the backdrop that ICE is due for a huge funding boost, especially in the big, beautiful bill, which also seeks to expand indefinite family detention, which is not words that should go together, but in some way they do. Now, Stephen Miller announced plans to further increase the rate of arrests by ICE. And the Dilley facility, one of the ones in Texas, where some of these abuses were documented, was at around 300 detainees. It could soon hold up to 2,400. It all paints the picture of a bad situation that is already getting worse. And add to that one very Floridian story, Alligator Alcatraz. It's a remote airport by the Everglades in Florida, about 60 kilometers from Miami, that is going to be transformed into a detention facility for around 1,000 detainees. It's going to cost somewhere around $450 million a year and is looking to be completed in 1 to 2 months. What makes this story particularly shocking, I guess, isn't the fact that this is happening in Florida. Alligator Alcatraz is absolutely the type of thing I would expect to see in Florida. However, the project is backed by federal funding through FEMA's shelter program. So, the disaster relief agency, FEMA. Yeah, somehow that money found its way into building detention centers, which is absolutely a thing that has happened. Now, Florida officials got a Florida officiate, and Attorney General of the state, James Uthmire, argued that the isolated location surrounded by alligators and pythons would act as a natural deterrent against escapees, and that you wouldn't even really need to do too much in terms of, fences and things, because there's nowhere for them to go. And he bragged about this in a social media post with rock music in the background. And it's just a wild thing. Go look it up. It's a very Florida thing to do. But there's a lot of serious implications of this as well. Of course, we're worried about human rights because of everything I've just said this whole episode. But also, there's potential devastating environmental impacts on the Florida Everglades with this massive construction that is going to be done very quickly. The Florida Everglades is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is a very important place in terms of biodiversity, in terms of just environmental impact. So the plan is drawing a lot of backlash from lawmakers, both over ecological concerns and human rights concerns. So I wanted to put all of these strange stories together to kind of illustrate how this mass detention industry is being formed between these private prison companies, between ICE, between the government and the Supreme Court, working in concert to put up the infrastructure for this. Because as bad as things have already been with the ICE raids, with people disappearing to SCOTUS, with all of that, this is the opening. This is the ramp, right? We haven't hit critical mass. There's so much more to come here, and all of these things play into the Trump administration's hands when the time comes to really, really ramp things up. We've seen how they've started to get the military involved in this, even just as a thin edge of the wedge in California. We're seeing all of these prisons being reopened. We're seeing facilities being built. And now we're seeing the deconstruction of rights through the Supreme Court and through the Trump administration attacking very worthwhile protections like the Flores settlement. And this is something that we have to keep following on this show. You've got to keep following it on your own, because the plans are to deport millions of people. And that takes a huge amount of infrastructure. That infrastructure isn't there, but it's being built. So if you're someone who cares about this issue, it's just so important to keep on top of these things and to know that there are people pushing back against these things. For example, the cities in Newark and Leavenworth trying to fight to stop these prisons from reopening. The tons of lawsuits being launched by advocacy organizations, the ACLU, dozens of others. So there are people trying to fight this infrastructure being built. Right now, however, it's pretty clear that the Trump administration is winning that fight, at least temporarily. That's going to about do it for this one. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, give us a 5-star rating on your podcast platform of choice, and tell all your friends. The Politics of New America is hosted by Nathan Stone and produced by Josh Carmody. You can follow us on Blue Sky at Politics New America.